Good morning. Randall Brown here. Welcome to another study. Today we're going to start a two-part series on the Abrahamic covenant. The first part that we'll do today is basically the historical aspects and basically is the story of Abraham in abbreviated form, of course, in Genesis. And then the second part will be about the spiritual aspects and the results, the consequences of that covenant to us as Christians. But here we're dealing primarily with Abraham and what will become the Jewish people. The story of Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant is rarely taught on because it's fairly long. This really covers several chapters, and we're just going to pick some of the highlights of that. So typically you'll hear a message on Abraham in relationship to faith because he's known as the father of faith. And of course that's the most important part of Abraham's story. But it's a little bit of a long story. But it's an interesting story, and I think it's kind of fun when we can get into these Bible stories because it's somebody's life. It's not a religious thing. It's somebody actually lived this life and went through all these things, went through famines and had a wife and met with kings and had battles and all sorts of things occurred in their life, and it makes the story interesting. So it's pretty interesting reading on its own, and unfortunately we'll have to skip different parts of that, but we're basically going to give you the highlights of what led up to the Abrahamic covenant, and then next time we'll get into how that affects us, because we're actually through Christ we become recipients of the Abrahamic covenant. So it's not just for the Jews. I mean, as we read about it in its first aspect, yes, it is in its beginning, in the formative fulfillment of this, or the natural fulfillment, it was to the Jews, but there's a greater spiritual fulfillment that is to the whole Israel of God, which includes born-again Jews and born-again Gentiles. But what we'll be seeing here is the kind of history that you're used to hearing about in relationship to the Abrahamic covenant, not to be confused with the Mosaic covenant, because the Mosaic covenant actually has very little to do with the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant was first. The Mosaic covenant was put into place basically, Paul teaches as a school teacher to prepare the people for the future and even greater covenant of Christ. And so what I'm saying here is the Abrahamic covenant and the Christ covenant are more closely related and tied together than the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. And the Mosaic covenant was a temporary covenant to get us through from the point in time of the Abrahamic covenant until Christ came to really fulfill the Abrahamic covenant and introduce the Christ covenant. So here we go. Let's get started in Genesis chapter 11. And we're going to be talking, first of all, about Terah. Terah is the father of Abraham. So here's a little history here to get us started. And that's Genesis 11, verse 31. And Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees. So Terah, he leaves with some of his family. He leaves Ur of the Chaldees. He leaves with some of his family. He leaves with Abraham, his son's son. He leaves with Lot, the son of one of his other sons. And Abraham was the son. Lot was basically the nephew, and then Abraham's wife. And they left from the Ur of the Chaldees. The Ur of the Chaldees doesn't, of course, mean anything to us, but it's discussed where this was, and of course there's always more than one opinion, but general consensus is that Ur of the Chaldees was probably what was formerly known as ancient Armenia, and basically Armenia is up there by Turkey and Iraq, and was sort of wiped out. So this ancient Armenia was what is now a part of Iraq. So basically, he left from Iraq and headed down towards Syria. And here it says he left from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. Now, the interesting thing is here is that he was headed, and keep this in mind, he was headed to a place called the land of Canaan, which is where present-day Israel is now. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 225 years, and Terah died in Haran. So he traveled, I'm not sure exactly how far, but let's say possibly as much as a couple hundred miles, kind of on a southwesterly direction towards Israel, towards Canaan, what in that time was known as Canaan. And so if we looked at the map today, you can see Iraq, northeast of Israel. He headed on a line that basically took him down in that direction, and he stopped at a place called Haran, which was roughly 300 miles north of present-day Jerusalem, kind of north, a little bit east, northeast. So he stopped there. So he was headed to Canaan, and apparently, I don't know where he got the idea, but he probably got the idea from God. But the people of that area, it's believed, were worshipers of the moon goddess, They weren't really worshipers per se of the God of the Old Testament, or the God of the Jews that we know about, and that is basically the God that we believe in today as Christians. But he felt, for whatever reason, he felt an urge, and I think he had a calling from God to head towards Canaan. Now, he'd never been to Canaan. They didn't know that land. And he headed and he got on his way, and he got partway there, less than halfway there, and he stopped and settled. And, they're nomadic people. And so, you feed your sheep, you feed your goats, and you travel and you stay in a pasture while it's good, and then you move on and so forth. So it was over a process of time, perhaps even years, he moved down this far and settled down here, but he never went all the way. And that sounds like, a lot of people, Christians with callings, we get callings in our life and things we feel to do, but we never quite get there. Well, Terah never quite got there, and he lived 205 years. At this time, men were still fairly long-lived to live 160, 170, 180, 200 plus years, where just a few generations before, they were living 700, 800, 900 years and more. And so already man's lifespan was being shortened at this time. And so he took his family and he moved to Haran, but he never got to Canaan. But yet he intended to go to Canaan, which it tells us in verse 31. So at this point, after Terah has died, now the Lord is going to speak to Abraham, Terah's son. And that takes us to chapter 12. Verse 1. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. So now the Spirit of God is really moving upon him and stirring his heart to leave everything behind, leave even the family and kindred that came with his father to Haran. He wants him to keep going, keep moving, keep heading south, keep heading east till he gets to Canaan. And he says in verse 2, God says to Abram, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curses thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So here we have the beginnings, the foreshadowings of the covenant that God actually makes with Abraham later on. At this time, I think he's around 75 years old when this call comes. For most of us, we're done by the time we're 75. You know, we're what you call retired. No big moves, no big plans, no big goals for us. But here at 75, he was just getting started. This is when the call of God really came upon him. So that's sort of encouraging to those of us who are older, who are concerned about missing the will of God and missing our destiny. We all have a destiny, and for some of us, our destiny is not fulfilled yet, even if we are in our 60s or maybe in our 70s. But he said to here that he would make him a great nation and make his name great, and that he'd bless him and he'd make him a blessing. And so this is the first promise to him. And he said he would bless those that bless him and curse those that curse him. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And this is something that we're going to see, that eventually the Abrahamic covenant reaches out to and enfolds all nations, all those who come through Christ, who is a seed of promise to Abraham, will come into a place of blessing through this covenant that began with one man. So what we have here is God began to single out a family, a person, to uphold his word and uphold his name and to elevate him. And he began to make him great. He began to make him somebody in the earth of that time. But it first just began with a word. It just began with a promise. And I'm reminded of the passage of Scripture that says, despise not the day of small beginnings. We all have to start with a word, a promise, a dream, a vision, and that's put in our heart by God. But then we have to be faithful to that, and we have to walk that out sometimes for our whole life. Now, so verse 3, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. That brings up the whole issue of Israel today. We want to be found on the side of blessing the nation of Israel, not on the side of cursing it. And as a nation, America, I'm happy to report at this time, politically, we are in that position of where we are a friend of Israel, we are an ally, and this puts us in a place of blessing with God. So verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. His nephew went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. And into the land of Canaan they came. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. So God, now he traveled down that approximately 300 miles into the heart of Canaan to a place here that is called Bethel. In verse 8, let's back up to 7 and deal with that for just a minute. Unto that thy seed will I give this land. Now, he says, unto thy seed will I give this land. So, now there's two levels that this promise or this prophetic word unfold in. One is his natural seed that we will see comes through the seed of promise, Isaac, but also through the spiritual seed, which passes through a natural lineage down through Isaac and down through David and down through the Jewish people and the tribe of Judah. Christ himself becomes that final seed of promise, and the one that ushers in or brings forth the final fuller spiritual fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. But here we're going to we're looking at it on two levels, but here we're looking at it now through the seed of his natural seed of his son Isaac, and we'll get into that more later. And so there he built an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. So Abraham built an altar. What does that mean? Well, he built an altar and he worshiped God. This is the first recorded incident where we have Abraham worshiping this God, this unknown God, in a sense, the God we call the I Am. He's no longer associated with the gods of his past, with the gods of his family, with the gods of his home country, with the moon goddess. He's worshiping this God that we call Jehovah, or we call Yahweh, or and he who calls himself I Am. And so in verse 8 it says, he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east, and there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So he began to call upon the name of the Lord. This is the beginnings, what we have of a relationship that Abraham has with God. Now, he already obviously had a relationship with God, and his father must have had a relationship with God, because his father was called to come to Canaan, but he never made it. And the Lord spoke to him and told him to come. So there was already a relationship going on, but here you might say we're seeing that relationship between this man and his God being formalized through sacrifice and through worship. And it's in Bethel, there he called upon the name of the Lord. And Bethel is a city, an area that's between 10 to 15 miles north of this present day city of Jerusalem. And at that time, Jerusalem's still in the same place that it was. So north of Jerusalem, but in the heart of what we call Israel, or at that time in the heart of a nation that was called Canaan. And we'll talk a little more about Canaan later, but Canaan was full of many giants, also not just normal-sized people, but giants. And that's a fun and interesting subject, which we'll touch on later. So now let's go to Genesis. Well, I did read 12, 1 through 8. So let's go to Genesis chapter 13, verse 12. So I'm going to just kind of gloss over the rest of chapter 12 there, just to say this much, that a flood came. Not a flood, but a famine came on the land. So Abraham journeyed. He moved on down and went clear down into Egypt because of this famine. And during that time, there's a whole story where the king of Egypt got pretty interested in Sarah, his wife, but he didn't know he was Sarah, his wife. So when he found out that he was Sarah, his wife, he was upset and concerned about the curse that was being brought on him for taking another man's wife. So he blessed Abraham. So Abram walked out of Egypt with even more cattle and more wealth than he had when he was there. And so he was blessed, and he came back up into this very same area that he had left, this Bethel area. But he was so rich or wealthy already and had so many cattle and so many sheep that the land could not sustain what he had and his nephew Lot had, so they split, and he gave Lot his choice. Of course, we know the story that Lot chose the plain that held Sodom and Gomorrah. So Abraham took the other part of the land in that area, and he ended up basically back in the Bethel area. So now we're picking it up there in chapter 13 and verse 12. Abraham, Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes. Now here they've separated, Lot and he have separated their flocks and their people. And now God speaks again to Abraham. And he said, lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. So he said, just look basically as far as you can see in every direction. I'm going to give you this land, and I'm going to give it to your seed forever. This covenant was a permanent, eternal covenant that he was making with this man. This is a significant covenant. No natural man could make it a covenant or an agreement on that level, because no man has that power to promise anything forever. The best you can do is something that an agreement that lasts for a lifetime or a generation, or perhaps a few generations, with a contract. But at some point, that you're not going to be able to maintain that. Governments change, nations change, wars come, different things, and the promise can't be kept. But God makes a promise. Here he makes what is basically an eternal promise. And he says, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Well, as the dust of the earth, that's an uncountable, the point being that's an uncountable number. That's like the stars of the heaven. That's an uncountable number. The grains of sand on the seashore, that's an uncountable number. He said, you're going to be blessed, and your seed is going to be expanded to the place that you can't number it. And of course, that's because this covenant, once it's made and once it's totally fulfilled, it starts with the nation of Israel that's birthed out of Abraham's loins, but it moves beyond a specific bloodline and moves into the bloodline of Christ and expands into a place where all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Anyone who receives Christ will enter in to this covenant and will be a partaker of an inheritance with the rest of the seed of Abraham. So verse 17 says, arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Then Abraham removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. So here again is this act of sacrifice and this act of worship before God. This is now a pattern. This is a habit. The I Am is the God of Abraham. He is the God he worships. He is the God he trusts. And Abraham is the man that God has chosen to bring forth his wealth, really, into people. And so, but he starts with one man who's willing to believe him. Now let's go to Genesis chapter 14, verse 18. Now, there again, going through what had occurred after what we just read was there was a war that went on in that land between 5 kings and 4 kings, and 5 kings came. There were these, the 4 kings and 5 kings. There were these 5 kings who were for 12 years served under these other kings and paid taxes, so to speak, every year. But in the 13th year they rebelled. And so these other kings came down to make war with them. And basically, they destroyed their nations. They took all their food. They took all their jewels. They took all their raiment, all their possessions. And they took anybody useful as a slave, women and children and young, healthy men. They took them and they took everything. They took everything that they had. And so this is and they also took Lot captive, because when they took the possessions of the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, they also took Lot and they took all his possessions. So Abraham hears about this, and so he's dwelling a little bit away, but he lines up with his allies. He has some friends, he has some neighbors, and they all get together and they take their souls out. And they all go, over 300 of them, and they go to make war. And in the night they go and slay these kings that had come in and taken the possessions of the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and some other kings. And he basically destroys those enemies and wipes them out and gets back all the possessions, all the stuff of the kings, and gets back all the souls and all the victuals, or all the food and all the jewels and all the raiment and all that sort of thing. And so they're all meeting up together at the valley of Shevet, which is the King's Dale. And in verse 18, something very extraordinary happens here. In verse 18 it says, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God." So here's this reunion of Abraham and his nephew Lot and all of possessions, and the king of Sodom has come, and everybody's rejoicing, everybody's happy, everybody's excited that they won and they got back their people and they got back their stuff. And this priest shows up, a high priest, actually. He's a high priest, the high priest of God. This is explained further in the book of Hebrews. But this Melchizedek, king of Salem, which means the king of peace or the king of righteousness, he was a significant figure. And we're going to talk, we're going to have a separate study on Melchizedek and the priesthood of the Melchizedek. But this guy, it says, was out without beginning of days and without end of days. He had no father and mother. He was some kind of spiritual being. I've heard said, it's not something that I can prove, so we can't put too much weight on it, but I've heard that said that he was the head of the Watcher Angels, which were a tribe of angels that ruled over and watched over the earth, not only in this creation, but perhaps in a prior creation. And this is all getting into a lot of tenuous areas, so we're not going to go too far in it. But this priest, this king, Melchizedek, was an eternal being. And if he was an angel, if he was a watcher angel, he was watcher angels are believed to be a group of angels that were clothed with flesh. And so here he shows up, basically representing God in the middle of this situation, because it's God that gave Abraham the victory in this situation because God's blessing was on Abraham. So Abraham went and got his son, and he won it back in battle. And so Melchizedek brings forth bread, he brings forth wine, there's a communion, there's a rejoicing, there's a sacrifice made in essence. And he says he was the priest of the Most High God, and he blessed him. So Melchizedek blessed as a representative of God, as the priest of the Most High God, and this is the God that Abraham worshiped. He blessed him, and he said, Melchizedek, he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth." Now we begin to get some description of this Most High God that Abraham was in league with and was about to make covenant with. And he blessed the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. So Melchizedek blessed Abram because he was the servant of the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. And he blessed God. As God's high priest, Melchizedek blessed God. He lived to be a priest and a king unto God. And he said, "Blessed be the Most High God," verse 20, "which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." See, this is because the blessing of God was on Abraham that he won this battle. "And he gave him tithes of all." So Abraham gave, and a tithe literally means 10%. Abraham literally gave 10% of all the goods, all the gold, all the food, all the treasures. He gave 10% of that to Melchizedek. So those of you who want to discuss tithing, tithing is prior to the Old Testament. I mean, it's prior to the Mosaic covenant. Tithing was done prior to the Mosaic covenant, and even those in the Mosaic covenant talks about those unborn priests that came in their loins, that were in the loins of Aaron. They gave tithes forward. In Melchizedek, it's a tithe. It's a recognition of the tithe that carries forward from the Old Testament. We'll see that also carries forward into the New Testament. But the tithe is another subject. In verse 21 it says, "And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet," or today's terms we'd say like a shoestring, but instead of a shoe latch, like instead of a sandal latch, a shoestring, "and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion." So basically, in the middle of all this that's going on, the king of Sodom says, "Hey, Abram, thanks for saving my stuff and saving my people and delivering me. Look, why don't you take all the stuff for saving us and just let me have my people back?" And Abram said, "No way, I'm not taking anything. Of course, we've eaten, my young men, my warriors have eaten of your stuff, and we appreciate that. Obviously we already took that, but we're not taking anything else. We're not taking any of your belongings, because I made a pledge. I swore to my God that I wouldn't take anything from you, lest somebody later on say that you're the one who made me rich, because my trust is in God, and it's God that will make me rich." He said, "However, I would, give the men, the allies that went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, give them their portion. They deserve something. They deserve some booty. They deserve some treasure, for they went out and risked their life and risked their men and fought for you. So give them something. Give them their portion, but nothing for me. So, because I want everybody to know that it's God that delivered my enemies into my hand this day. And it's God that I put my trust in. And it's God that will bless me and make me wealthy. All right. So now chapter 15, starting in verse 1. And after these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision. So now a vision, God gives Abram a vision saying, fear not, Abraham. And in this vision, he says, fear not, Abram. I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Now God begins to make a greater promise and a covenant with him. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt you give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus. He said, God, what can you give me? I don't even have an heir here. He said, my servant who from Syria, he's my heir basically right now. What could you give me? Basically, he's saying, hey, I have nothing if I can't pass this on, if I don't have an heir. And so Abram said, behold, to me thou hast given no seed. That's a big deal in those days, to be able to have seed and to carry on your family and to extend your family and to carry on your name. Your prowess, your real wealth was in having children and having that wealth and having the family name carried on. Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. Right now, the situation is my line's not going to be even carried on. You've promised me that I'm going to have seeds as the dust of the earth. I'm going to have children as the dust of the earth, and you're going to mightily bless me. But I don't even have an heir to carry this on. How can this thing come to be? What are you going to do for me that lets me know you're going to do that? And the answer is, in verse 4, it says, and behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. So what he's saying is, look, your servant's not going to be your heir. I'm going to give you an heir out of your own bowels. A seed from your own loins is going to be your heir. In verse 5 it says, and he brought him forth abroad and said, look now toward heaven. So he takes him out, probably on a hilltop, and said, look now toward heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto them, so shall thy seed be. Again, he reiterates the promise, said, look at the stars of heaven. Your seed, your heirs, your family will be so large that it'll be the same amount as the stars of heaven. It'll be a vast amount that can't even be counted. And when God promised him that, took him forth and promised him that, then something happened, something clicked in Abram's head and in Abram's heart. And it said he believed. Verse 6 says he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. This is what Paul talks about, why Abraham is the father of faith. He's the first one who really made a commitment to God on a level where he just believed and trusted in God because God said it, because God promised it. He had no evidence that it was. He was already late. We don't even know what age he was here, but he's probably in his 80s at this point. And he was already really too late for him to have a child on his own, but he believed God and he counted it to him for righteousness. So when he said, God, I hear what you're saying, and I believe what you're saying, and I put my trust in you, God counted that to him for righteousness. He entered into a relationship with God that couldn't be broken. He was in a right standing with God. He was in the right place with God. And God, in a sense, joined himself to Abraham and made this promise that Abraham would be his man, and he would be his God. And in verse 7, he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. Say, hey, I'm the one that brought you from where you were into this place, and I didn't bring you for nothing. I brought you to inherit this land. And Abraham said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? What's my token? What's my sign? And so God said to him, and this is where they begin to enter in, they actually make the covenant or cut the covenant. And he said unto him, take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another, but the birds divided he not. So he divided these animals that he had, he laid them out, and he laid them down one on each side, and there was a path through the middle of them. But the birds divided he not, because they were small. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, when the vultures came down to try to eat the meat and pick at the meat, Abraham drove them away. So he's made this sacrifice before God, and he's laid it out, and now he's standing there vigilant over it, protecting it, so that the vultures don't come and destroy the sacrifice. And when the sun was going, so he did this all day. He was doing this all day. It was a hot day. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. So he, after being all day and fighting off the vultures all day in the hot sun, the sun goes down, it begins to cool off, and he's tired and he's weary. And he probably sits down or even lays down, and a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. And lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. He entered into a deep sleep, in something not a normal sleep, but a heavy sleep, a deep sleep, and he went into a vision-like state or a trance-like state, and darkness came upon him because he began to see out into the future, and he began to see some of the dark things that his heir and his heirs and the tribes that followed after him would go through. And so he sees forward into the future, and he sees what's going to happen, and God begins to speak to him. In verse 13, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And this is, we have to go forward, fast forward now into this time when Abraham had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. And one of those sons was Joseph. And we know the story of how he was sold into slavery. And he ended up in Egypt, and Joseph ended up being the number 2 man of the Pharaoh, and had wielded great power and basically ruled the nation of Egypt down in the future. And during that time there was a great famine, and the rest of his brothers and their families came into Egypt, and they were sustained in Egypt. But then that Pharaoh died, and other pharaohs came, and Joseph died, and other pharaohs came that didn't know Joseph. And so they began to afflict the tribes, that began to afflict the 12 tribes of Israel, and they made them make bricks and build things for them, and they were basically slaves, and they were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And of course, when Moses the deliverer was sent, And we know the whole story. If anybody saw the movie Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston knows the whole story, how God delivered Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, out of the nation of Egypt with a strong arm and parted the sea. And they moved forward. Of course, then they went 40 years in the wilderness and then finally entered in to the promise that was promised right here. This is the covenant that set it in stone, a blood covenant between Abraham and God that established forever that God would honor his promise and would bring his people, the lineage through Abraham, into the land, the promised land, the land of Canaan, which became Israel. Okay, so let's go back to verse 14. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and speaking of judging Egypt, and afterwards shall they come out with great substance. When they came out, all of their Egyptian neighbors gave them gold, gave them jewels, gave them substance. They walked out of that nation basically with their 400 years of wages that hadn't been paid to them. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Now he's telling Abraham, you're going to go to your fathers in peace. You're not going to see this, but I've taken you forward in so that you see what's going to happen, and you see through even the 400 years of affliction and the 40 years of the wilderness. There's a time coming when your people will receive this covenant that I have, the benefits of this covenant that I have made with you. And thou shalt be buried in a good old age. And Abraham was buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation, at the end of this 400 years, they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So now here is the Amorites. He's saying, look, it's not yet time for you to receive the land of Canaan that I promised you. You can't have it now because the wickedness is not yet full here. These people don't yet deserve to be ousted out of their land because their wickedness hasn't come up to a level where it has to be judged and dealt with. But by the time that you come into this land, I will be ready to judge these nations, these people, for their ungodliness and for the horrible sins that they have been doing. So there was a time lapse there that waited for the fullness of evil to come forth in these nations so that they deserved to be judged and removed from the land of Canaan. And then the land of Canaan would be given to Israel. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. God himself began to pass through these pieces, through these sacrifice, and a smoking, it talks about that presence being a smoking furnace, a dark fire, and a burning lamp that passed through those pieces. And he walked through the sacrifice. He accepted the sacrifice. He accepted and joined the covenant and made the covenant with Abraham. And in that same day, verse 18, in that same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. That's all the way, that piece of land is all the way from the Nile River in Egypt, all the way to the Euphrates, which runs over there in Iraq. And way over there, it's a vast tract of land that's far bigger than what Israel is settling on now. So it's still, that fulfillment, that level of fulfillment is yet to come. And it will come in the days ahead. And there's a lot of nations, I suppose, that will be unhappy about that. But this promise was made from God thousands of years ago, before those nations ever inherited. And with what God promises, God does. And it will happen. And that will be the complete fulfillment in the natural realm to Israel to receive all of this vast tract of land. And that's where it says the Kenites and the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaims, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites all lived and dwelt. And many of these tribes and many of the tribes and the peoples in them were tribes of giants who practiced cannibalism, who practiced horrible rites, who practiced the burning of their own children, the destruction and sacrifice of their own children. And God at one point was determined to wipe them out, even as he wiped out the giants because of their evil during the days of Noah. And that flood, I talked about in the days of Noah, there were giants in those days. And in the days after, there were giants again. And the whole source of how the giants came about, and the Nephilim, and this different thing, this is a whole big subject, a fascinating topic that we'll have to deal with at another time. But let's try to see if we can get on through this. We're running a little short on time, so let's look real quickly at Genesis 16, verses 1 through 4. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid the Egyptian, and Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to be to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. And he was probably in his late 80s at this point. And so Sarah, who couldn't bear children, who was past bearing children, gave Abram her handmaid to wife, and she bore him, he went in unto her, and she bore him a child whose name was Ishmael. And Ishmael, that's another whole story. Anyway, Abram's wife, Sarah, was then, let's read verse 4. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. So that whole thing backfired. And of course, there's enough blame to go around Sarah giving him to wife, Abraham, of course, being apparently more than willing to go in unto her, and they conceived. She had Ishmael, and of course Ishmael became the father of 12 tribes of some of the Arabic nations. But he worked against, and he tortured, and he tormented, let's say, the child of promise that came later. And so he and Hagar were cast out, but God delivered them and took care of them. But he was not to be the seed of promise. This was Abraham trying to help God fulfill his covenant to give him a son out of his own loins. In the natural, it was a natural way of trying to fulfill the covenant. But this thing, we'll find out, wasn't fulfilled through the natural and couldn't be fulfilled in the natural. It was a God thing. So let's finish up in chapter 17 here. Genesis 17, let's read right now 1 through 10. And when Abram was 99 years old and was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. So God comes back to him. He's 99 now. It's been almost 25 years since God first began to speak to him about this covenant, and he's gone in faith, but he tried to fulfill it in a natural way because he's never yet had a child with Sarai. And verse 5 says, God says, Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, But thy name shall be called Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. The word Abraham means father of a great multitude. So now God says to him, look, change your name from Abram to Abraham, because I'm making you a father of a great multitude. I'm making you a father of many nations. And he says, I have made thee. It's done in God's mind. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And of course, there were 12 tribes that came forth, and that moved into 2 nations. And then, of course, there's the dispersion of Jews at different times. We don't know where they all went. We don't know everything that happened to them. Some people believe that many of those Jewish people and Jewish tribes scattered and formed many of the European nations. I've heard it said that England was founded out of one of these tribes, and that there's a king, the Queen of England sits on the throne. There's still kings sitting on the throne today in the natural realm. But we don't know exactly what happened or didn't happen, but we know that the Jews survived through till the coming of Christ, and of course the inheritance was fulfilled in Christ. The covenant began to be fulfilled in Christ. He established the covenant, and so he reigns from heaven even now forevermore. So the promise was fulfilled in him, even though we have not yet seen the full manifestation of that come to pass. And we will talk about that in the next part of this study. In verse 6 it says, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations. He says, I'm going to just carry this covenant forth and establish it with your seed, with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, with Joseph, and on down the line with David, and finally and eventually through Christ, for an everlasting covenant to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. And this is an everlasting covenant, an agreement, a joining together of God the Almighty God, who ruler and possessor of heaven and earth, and a chosen people who have come. Here Abraham came to him in faith and believed and received the status of righteous because he believed what God had promised him. And down today we receive that status of righteousness because of what we have received through the death and resurrection of Christ. And I will give unto thee and thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So look, in the end, I don't know what all's happening in the meantime here, but Israel has been reestablished. This is a sign of the times, and that is only going to be expanded, and in the end, we even talk about a new Jerusalem coming down where it's expanded into the spiritual scope. And that realm, that city itself is 1,500 miles wide, 1,500 miles long, 1,500 miles high. Probably in a new earth realm, a revised earth that's even expanded in its size to be able to handle a city nation, Jerusalem. A city nation of this size. But that also is another subject for another time. In verse 9 it says, and God said unto Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. And so in that circumcision was a token of the covenant between them. Abraham went out and circumcised every male in his family. And of course, that's where the tradition of circumcision comes from, and it's all tied back to this original covenant that God made with Abraham. Okay, for today, the last passage of Scripture, we're going to read verse chapter 17, verses 15 through 21. And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. Sarah means princess. And I will bless her, and give her thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Sarah was a part of this covenant. And then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And Abraham said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before me. He said, God, thanks. What a fantastic promise, but is that even possible? You know, look, I got Ishmael. Let the promise be fulfilled through him. And God said, Sarah, thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. What God said is, hey, I'm doing something. It's supernatural through you, your body which is dead at 100, and Sarah's which is dead at 90. I'm going to supernaturally make this thing happen. You're going to produce a child between you two. He's the seed of promise that I'm bringing this covenant to pass through, and his name shall be called Isaac. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful. He said he would bless and make Ishmael fruitful as well. And I will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at the set time in the next year. So 9 months later, the set time, Isaac was born to Abraham and Sarah, 100 years old and 90 years old. A miracle, a supernatural intervention of God to cement and solidify and establish the covenant. Because if God says it, it will come to pass. If God says it is true, because he cannot lie, and because he makes the covenants, secondarily, it's going to have to come to pass, and he'll do whatever he has to do, move heaven and earth to make it come to pass. He'll move in the natural realm. He'll move in the supernatural realm to establish what he's promised. We can count on God 100% of the time to fulfill his word. Anything that he has promised us, he will do. That is why this book, the Bible, is such a fantastic book, because it is full of the promises of God. It is full of the covenants of God, and he will establish every one of them, and we are made partakers of those covenants. Next time we're going to look at how we become inheritors of the Abrahamic covenant along with the rest of Israel. It's fascinating. It's exciting, and it's something that we all have to look forward to. And we'll talk about it more next time. God bless you.